Maybe it's just the castle shipper in me, but I always thought that Warren, yeah, Warren and Layla should have been together.
Welcome to Superhero Sundays, hosted by Mika and Becca. We talk Caped Crusaders in all their glory, from romance to action to downright bad writing and good writing. Grab a cup of coffee or a tasty treat because we're about to dig in.
In a world, or rather, in the 2000s, every kid was the chosen one. From Sky High to Sharkboy and Lavagirl, we grew up with saccharine tales of unlikely heroes banding together with friends, family, and even foes to save the world and get the girl. This is why Sky High is infinitely more entertaining than watching Avengers Endgame. Without further ado, let's go into it. So, 2000s movies. What, like, the source material that we considered for this video was films like Sky High, the ever acclaimed Sharkboy and Lavagirl, Zoom, the Spider-Man trilogy, Underdog, Son of the Mask, The Legend of Zorro, I have in caps. It's a classic to me. Mostly we'll be talking about Sky High since that's the one we most recently watched, so yeah.
I love that The Legend of Zorro is in there. I feel like there's some I haven't even seen, but like I don't think I've seen Zoom and I don't think I've seen Underdog, but I know that they're similar. Just like by nature of like the film poster, they definitely all fit in the category.
I've seen both. I remember and retain nothing, but in Zoom, I think they have like orange jumpsuits at some point, and they like stand in front of a fighter pilot or like some sort of aircraft, and they're like a family that is learning how to be super together. It was like not as great as The Incredibles though, which I feel like I should have put on here as well, but I didn't.
The Incredibles?
Yeah.
I feel like they definitely had, The Incredibles had that vibe, but of course it was animated. I think that it's the live action vibe that's really selling it here.
Yeah. I don't know like how to really dive into why I find Sky High more entertaining than Endgame, but I think the first thing that came to mind is like just color, like the and going off of that, the tone, it's just lighter. And I know that in the late 2010s, and I guess now too, there's like this draw towards like Christopher Nolan-esque grittiness and realism, and it just, I don't know. I thought of Hemingway for some reason. I'm like, I don't vibe with that.
Yeah, no, because it was very bright, and I think we see this not just with these films, but in TV and stuff too. From the early 2000s, it was a very different feel. Not in exactly the same way, but like movies now, especially these superhero movies, it's not that they're gritty per se or lacking in color, because like Endgame definitely has color, but it's definitely like full. There's a lot happening, which isn't inherently bad, but I think that like something like Sky High, which is obviously more like geared towards kids, it's simpler in a very engaging way. Like bold blocks of color compared to the more intricate sort of stuff that you would get with a blockbuster like Endgame.
Right. I guess I can actually refer to my notes because I put them down.
That's what they're there for.
Yeah. I love my little disclaimer. I'm no expert or film buff, but context is crucial here. And Sky High came out before Marvel even became the behemoth that it is in terms of like the cinematic universe. And so at the time, X-Men was doing pretty well, but on the surface, again, like Sky High was zany and it's relatable and it has really, I guess, granular or like mundane plot lines, but that's why it's relatable, because it's focused. And I think that's what I miss about the solo movies too of Marvel, is that they were a lot more like character driven, and obviously it's hard to do that when you have like a bunch of characters in one movie. But by the time Endgame did come around, it did come at like the tail end of a decade where people were being more socially aware. So the movements for justice have always existed, but I think that the awareness with the advent of social media has just like, woo. So people tend to put like the idea of something being, again, realistic on a pedestal, and then they kind of equate that to darkness, like having dark and edgy plot lines is more realistic. But I would argue that the goofy and like the optimism of Sky High is like pretty brilliant, and it can be done today. I think the movie that I kept drawing back to that is more recent is Into the Spider-Verse, and it's animated, but I think it, like the fact that the storyline was more hopeful and zany still, but people still cite it as like one of the best movies ever. I think it can be done. I think what Sky High did can be done, obviously in animation because of like the art medium of it all, but also live action. I would argue you can do that again. we can love light colors again, guys. It's okay.
I had a note that kind of went with that, which was that these early 2000s superhero family flicks and like Spy Kids, like that kind of vibe, they really were for the family. So it was definitely like kids movies. It was things that you could watch like with your young kids. But adults are, I feel like, especially when you look at like something like Disney, which is like family animated films, there's always something for an adult to take out of it too. And I feel like this is the case, especially with a movie like this with Sky High, which I think is probably one of the better ones of the bunch here. I noted that it was really great as an adult to rewatch, because it's been forever, and follow Will's journey of self-worth, the expressions of loyalty from his friends, because if you watch a lot of media, like that kind of conflict can really get dramatic, and it felt like that wasn't an issue in the movie, which was kind of refreshing. But in the film, you can also see where the adults fell flat, and I feel like your perspective as a teen looking at those adults versus as an adult looking at the adults is different. And I found that they were like very kind of like one-dimensional, which was definitely intentional, and stuck in these caricatures. But because of the kids, they were able to kind of break out of that. And I just feel like that's such a fulfilling like thing to take out of those movies. And I think it kind of reflects a little on like what you can pull out of Into the Spider-Verse, where it's this like, obviously it's this young kid who that's the perspective you're looking at, but the things that are happening around him as well are important. Or for example, Peter B's role in that movie is supposed to be that like the hero that's not really what he's like chalked up to be.
I know that what bothered me watching the movie now was definitely the response that Will got towards the end, where he's like taking accountability for the fact that, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have handled that situation the way that I did. Maybe I should have like stuck up for my friends more, that sort of thing. Where I think he's talking to his parents, and I believe it's his dad who just like completely brushes it off.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense for the character, because throughout the film you see him constantly brush things like that off for Will.
How can I be mad?
Feels like she's harder on him. But it still bothered me that they were like, no, it's totally okay. Honestly, my biggest gripe with the movie is the fact that Will got the girl at the end. I just think that it was totally fine.
To him.
Yeah, that like he reintegrated in his friend group. I think that's totally earned and natural. But maybe it's just the castle shipper in me. But I always thought that Warren and Layla should have been together, at least like, I don't know, maybe like that isn't even an endgame for that movie. They just sort of move past all of that.
She's cute. If they did a sequel, I know that they would move on.
Yes.
Like that wouldn't last.
Yeah.
I agree. I do think that within the movie, it's like he does all of this learning, and throughout the film, from the very beginning, he's like, I remember when we were watching, and the first time he has like all of his friends over, and he stands up to his dad, and he's like, I don't have any powers. I was like, that's really cool of him to do this early. Obviously, the conflict built off of that, but like he had these moments that he was like, I realized that I messed up, and I just want to say I'm sorry. And his parents were like, No, it's fine.
Say it's
That really was so weird. And he didn't like double down. The movie didn't double down on it. They just really dismissed it, which was strange. So that ending was a little funky in that way, especially because he not only got the girl, but he did get all of his powers. And he got like, you know, I'm spoiler alert, but he got, you know, to be recognized as the hero that, you know, he was supposed to be. So that is a little imbalanced, I would say.
Yeah, and I would say that Ron, my husband, I feel like I kind of hated, even as a kid, I kind of hated that he got powers. I know that it was like a cutesy and he also fell into a vat of powers, so he like was able to achieve his dreams, but I loved that he didn't have powers and was still a hero in his own right. And so it always bothered me as a kid, and I thought maybe rewatching it that it wouldn't bother me anymore, but it still bothered me.
We're talking about the things that we don't like, which is fair. I feel like if we were to do, because we've compared it with Endgame, I feel like if we were to do a comparison and like really like rewatch Endgame and really lay out everything that was frustrating. My thing is, not to derail too much, but if we did rewatch Endgame, which sounds like a chore for me personally.
Yeah, it is. It's an emotional chore.
It's not going to be the same as watching it the first time, because with something like this, it's standalone, so you can get the fulfillment you need out of it. With something like Endgame, it was the end of a very long series of movies, and it felt very flat, for us anyway. But it was also hyped up to be really, really good. A lot of people loved it. So that's kind of where this comparison's coming from, as opposed to one of the other movies. I think that if you wanted to compare it to a Marvel movie in sort of style or, you know, kind of the feeling, that you might compare it to like the first Iron Man. Because it is an early 2000s superhero movie, and it was kind of at the beginning of the franchise, and I think it had some of that comedy, some of the bright color that like wasn't so overwhelming. Like, it didn't have the Dark Knight overwhelmingness to it. It was a little more poppy. Like, I think that was really cool back then, which obviously the MCU doesn't really do that as much anymore to that degree.
Unfortunately. The fact that, I don't think that, obviously, if we were going to do a deep dive comparison, really, of Sky High and Endgame, they're two different animals. Which is why I think it's important to remember that Sky High came before all of the let's create a whole freaking franchise. Like, again, X-Men existed, but it was only like a trilogy really at the time, and then they expanded it as well. But yeah, I feel like, I don't know, I don't want to like derail into Endgame territory because that's a lot. Yeah, I feel like with Endgame, I mean, there was still the hope. I think more than anything, it's just like a reflection of where people are at culturally, like in that time. I feel like obviously there's like problematic tropes, and the 2000s people weren't as socially aware as they are now. But even then, like, I found like the found family trope in Sky High more genuine than infinitely more genuine than Endgame and the Avengers in total. Like, especially I think of like the girl power scene.
Girl group, yeah,
in Endgame. I'm like, that doesn't feel genuine. And I don't remember actually who I was talking to. I know it was the guy. I don't know which guy I was talking to, but when I brought that up, they were like, oh, but that's totally like for the marketing of it all. And I'm like, well, obviously, yes, like, I get that. That, like, trust me, I understand. It's not landing. Like,
no.
It's
marketing
not.
To who? Because it didn't hit with us.
Yeah, and I know, I know that he, like, phrased it as, it's marketing for little girls. But I'm like, I feel like that's severely underestimating little girls. I feel like I would have, as a kid, I would have been excited to be like, wow, all these girls are working together. But knowing myself, I'd also be like, but they're not friends. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and maybe it's because I grew up with like the Winx Club and Bratz and like Totally Spies, like established female friendships in superhero-esque like dynamics. I feel like it's I don't know. I feel like that scene was just a disservice, and I just feel like Sky High, if they did have a scene like that, it would have been more genuine. And they didn't, and they had like a lot of like, I feel like somebody might be like, oh, but like Gwen and Layla didn't get along at all, and they were like totally mean to each other. And yeah, you're correct there. But I also feel like if they did draw more on like Layla and, oh gosh, what's her name? Magenta. I feel like if they drew on Layla and Magenta's friendship, it would have been a lot more fulfilling to watch. Again, it's like a standalone, but I don't know. Just have a lot of gripes with Endgame.
No, that makes sense. A lot of that is like off screen, right? That bonding is off screen. But it is what, an hour and a half of length, you know? Whereas the franchise obviously had a lot more time. I think, not to keep talking about Endgame, we're gonna have to change the title of the episode. But the one of the issues with that scene is that it just tastes bad because they've like killed off two of the main female characters.
Yes, that's very true.
They kept pushing back one of like, and behind the scenes kept pushing back the main female Avengers movie, and now it's coming out after she died. Like, I know it doesn't take place after she died, but it's like, okay, you could have let up with this. She should have had 3 by now. It just tastes bad to shove it in. And I think that, like, to your point, it does a disservice to kids because, especially like little girls, because like they don't get to see those heroes on their own really thrive. And I know that people really thought Pepper was going to have a lot more too, especially after Iron Man 3. And she just didn't. And, you know, that's the real world, which is fine. But I think that in Sky High, even though, because this is a drawback, even though they don't have a lot of female characters, I mean, I would argue it's a balanced in that there's just not many characters that they work with. You know, there's a handful of boys and there's a handful of girls, really, but there is still less. Layla especially, I feel, does kind of come into her own. She's supposed to be this person that's like pretty well-rounded. I know at the time, because the 2000s really like doing this, where they were like dismissing like social activist characters, especially white girls.
To participate in this test would be to support a flawed system.
Really like cared about the environment. That's a trope. They so they definitely were playing into that, but I think that despite being that trope, sorry, I'm jiggling a little bit, she was able to kind of like really own her own emotions and her own like strength and stuff.
Right.
I think if I were a kid, I would have liked her, you know, that character. So I think that she was a really good standalone character, and I think that on the other side, Gwen was terrible. Written well, but irritating.
Don't me.
And I know that we talked about this, but her portrayal of Gwen was like so
dared to spurn her genius.
That like, as that kind of character, that we both like were really affected by her.
I think watching it now as like as an adult, I was like kind of annoyed with Layla, but to your point, I do remember that in the 2000s that was a thing. Like, you weren't really cool if you were vegan, you weren't really cool if you cared about social justice. I think looking back on it now, I think it just rubbed me the wrong way, just because it was just white feminists.
Yeah, it's like scratching.
And a girl, and a woman.
Or her.
You're like paving the way.
100%.
But yeah, I do agree. And I think that
Magenta didn't get that, but
I was gonna say, like, I wish that they had afforded her more screen time. Obviously, again, standalone movie is just like an hour and a half. It's not like 3 hours like Endgame. Drawing back on the hope of it all, cued Taylor Swift in my brain. But I think that, like, there's that TikTok about how if you want to get back into reading, you, like, go into junior fiction, because most people stop when they get to junior or, like, middle grade fiction. And, like, typically the fiction, I mean, the stories there have to do with like found families and like really finding hope and self-confidence and all of that, and how it's fulfilling, and how like more adult stories should like dive deeper into that. I feel like that's what I get out of watching Sky High versus like Endgame, where like when you watch it as an adult, it's like, wow, this is really wholesome and nice and refreshing from all of like the realism of it all. Woke up and I watched the Gossip Girl remake trailer this morning.
There's a Gossip Girl remake?
On HBO Max.
Oh no!
Yeah. Somebody had commented and they were like, if this is like another Riverdale kind of show where they're like, let's take this thing from your childhood and let's make
even grittier.
I am so tired of stories being taken more seriously as art just because they are dark and gritty. Just because a story is depressing doesn't mean that it's good. Just because a story is sad doesn't mean that it's profound. Why do we not take romantic comedy seriously, for example? I think we mistake darkness for depth, but there is just as much depth in joy as there is in darkness. And I wish we took joy and happiness more seriously as emotions and experiences that are profound. What would it look like for a story to be about profound joy, about profound love and community?
At least in some way, creators are trying to create original stuff because of the Marvel burnout. Because of the Marvel DC burnout. There are creators that are trying to push either smaller comics or
That's true.
original stuff to the forefront now, which is really exciting. So hopefully we get more things like Sky High, which is fun in part because they're caricatures of characters that we already know. So like you can see a little bit in Will's dad. You can see Clark Kent a little, but he is also his own character.
Josie, you've got to stop babying the boy.
You're right, you're right.
And he's a play on the idea of that like toxic masculinity. Like, I remember like how unnerving it was, especially because we take things so seriously now, how unnerving it was when he opened the drawer after breaking the phone and there was a bunch of replacement phones. Because I was like, that's a problem.
Yeah.
You've got a problem. But like, I think it was treated lightly for a reason. I mean, it was the 2000s and things like that are treated lightly, but I think it just goes to show that we kind of need a little bit of the light and less of the serious, because that was my first response. Which I think is fair. And if I were to do something like that with that kind of parent, I think but in a light movie like that, I think having those dark undertones isn't bad. And the fact that they're undertones adds to it, as opposed to an overt narrative about how his aggression is really a problem in the household and how Will was scared to talk to him. And like that's having it a little lighter makes it a little more comfortable because you don't have as much to be scared of, but there's still strong conflict throughout the film, so it works out really well. And I think like to your point, to bring back into the Spider-Verse back into this, like there's some of that there too. Like there's some of that discord that's a little heavy, and obviously for other social issues, because they do have social issues in that movie, it is a little heavier, but it does have sort of the playful elements as well, which is really nice.
Yeah. I think in conclusion that, especially in response to the pandemic, because I don't want to say coming out of the pandemic, because the pandemic is still happening, that more and more I feel that people, because a lot of the times in my as I was finishing my program, people would always like talk about, do you want to see pandemic related content? And the majority was like, no, I don't want that realism reflected, it's too soon. And I feel like that definitely has an effect on how personally I consume content now, which is why I'm like the 2000s, so I don't want to romanticize the 2000s.
There's nostalgia there.
Yeah, there's definitely a nostalgic element which will like tint my glasses rosy or whatever. I totally messed up that saying, but I feel like there's still value in bringing back the whole idea that things don't have to be as grim, like aesthetically and plot-wise. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, I'm not saying let's just do away with dark storylines, because I love the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yeah.
I do think that there's space and value and worth to those stories, but I also think that the time for superhero stories with the light aspect to it, I feel like they deserve more space now more than ever. So like hearing creators talk about like their comics and like their stories and like their short films, I think that's so important, because I mean we can't really get into the capitalism of Marvel either. So yeah, in conclusion, we need more light. Give me the light colors, give me the pastels, all of that.
More, I think that it's a little bit of a bigger issue. Like, it's a small part of a bigger issue, which is the movie industry. It's like everything, you know, especially with the pandemic, we're sitting here like twiddling our thumbs about film and the conversion to streaming, and that, you know, you're not getting the same feeling out of things that you would have gotten in the past. I mean, there's a shift for kids movies as well. I'm not a parent, so maybe I'm not seeing them as much because it's not advertised to me. But I feel like it's not quite what it used to be. And I feel like for superhero movies, there's this huge saturation and all of these billion-dollar expectations on the idea of a superhero. And so people are both burnt out, and then creators are maybe discouraged. But I think that we've really seen a lot of people try to bring some stuff out, which is great. And I think the best way that we can get those kind of films and those stories is if we bring those people up to the front, like boost small creators, you know, creators that maybe don't have as much of a backing. They've got good ideas and they just need to get it out there. Instead of, you know, kicking back with old Tony Stark over here, who's, you know, been around 800 years.
Yeah. And like, don't get us
still want Robert Downey Jr. to play him somehow, so like just saying let it go.
We can let it go. And like, we love that franchise. Like, okay, I had a whole shrine to Captain America. I still have all of my Captain America merch. Like, I love the Marvel franchise. I love like DC, but I'm burnt out like a lot of people, and those are not the only superhero stories that exist or can exist. I guess I have to really write that superhero movie that I keep talking about that I want to write and then never do.
We need the fun. One thing I just want to add in our concluding statements is that Sky High was fun because it didn't take itself seriously. You have like the silliest powers. Some girl turned into a ball.
Yeah.
Like, that's fun. And I think that there's a difference. Like you said, they're two different animals. The mainstream like blockbuster superhero versus like a family film. But all those other movies that we listed earlier, even down to like Tesoro, like we said, are very like, the action is fresh, the comedy is fresh, there's certain like elements of color and lighting and directing that are really nice, the characterization's different, like it just doesn't take itself too seriously, which is good, and we definitely need a balance.
Yeah.
So that's our 2 cents on Sky High. Go watch it for a good time.
Join us next time on Soup or Hero Sundays.
Nice.
Where we'll get hearty. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye.
Love it. Bye.
But hey, that's high school.
Try not to drop your clipboard.